Hola, Ariel.
You cannot see us. Wait a minute.
Hello.
There we go. Hola, hola a todos. Morning.
How are you? Hi, Kun.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good.
Nice seeing you. It's Maria, it's a long time ago.
Vamos a interpretación, ¿no?
Sí, sí. Now we have
Translation. Yes.
simultaneous translation. You can.
But anyway, we are going to continue the session of this morning. And now in the program, we have Robert Adam.
Harriet, que también es de-
Harriet?
Harriet.
Harriet, yes, Harriet. We are going to continue the program, and Robert Adam is a consultant architectural consultant for Adam Architecture, and Harriet Wenberg. Both they are going to speak to us. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Buenos dias a todos. I think I'm going to just very briefly introduce INTBAU, which is the charity that I represent, and Robert as well as its chairman and one of its founders as well. So I'll speak briefly about INTBAU before introducing Robert to get onto the subject of discussion. Bear with me whilst I share my screen. I'm just going to show a few slides. There we are. So INTBAU, we are the International Network for Traditional Building, Architecture and Urbanism. And our founder and patron is His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. And effectively, INTBAU exists to be a global network dedicated to creating better places to live through traditional building, architecture and urbanism. So much of what we do is very relevant to the course that you're on now, just exploring the different environments in which we live and how they relate to one another, be they rural, be they urban, or somewhere in between. Some brief facts. We have an international college of chapters made up of one representative from each of the more than 30 national chapters that the network now comprises, and that includes Spain, it includes Portugal, but also countries further around the world from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Australia, Cyprus, Cuba. We are a very global mix. We actually now have more than 7,000 general and professional members. We've got members from more than 100 countries in total, and we've been around since 2001, so nearly 20 years old. This just as a quote that sort of inspires some of what INTBAU is about, which is that tradition, not meaning to look after the ash, but to keep the flame alive, just in that these traditions, these ways of making not just buildings, but places comprised of more buildings, and spaces, these are living traditions and passed on from generation to generation. So very briefly to run through some of what we do. Every 2 years we have a World Congress and present some awards in London. The next will be at the end of October 2021, immediately ahead of COP26, the major climate event, which is happening in Glasgow next year, all postponed from this year for obvious reasons. Images from the Congress. We also present a travel scholarship to an architecture student every 2 years, which can be on a subject of that student's choosing. We're about to open the call for entries for that. So if anyone on this is an architecture student or knows of an architecture student interested in matters to do with traditional building, architecture, urbanism, we would urge them to apply. We run a summer school each year in Sweden, 4-week program in classical architecture. And again, anyone interested in just really learning more about understanding architecture and how drawing by hand helps us to create buildings and the sort of rigors of the classical idiom, then that's a great course to participate in, and happens in a very beautiful part of Sweden. We also have now an INTBAU center, a training and resource center in a place called Makri in Pakistan, where we will be having a program of zero carbon architecture workshops for students both from Pakistan and abroad, and all are very welcome to come and participate in those. Some images from Pakistan and a series of workshops that we held this past November with the INTBAU Center pictured top left. We also, sort of relevant to this course, have a series of projects that we run in Spain together with our chapter for Spain, and those include awards for master craftspeople, a directory of those craftspeople created so that it's easy to find people who are masters and experts in working with different materials from all around Spain. We present the Manzano Prize for new traditional architecture. Robert is the chair of the jury for that. There's a summer school associated with the name of the prize as well in traditional architecture and placemaking. And we also have an architecture competition to help Spanish municipalities for finding design solutions to problems that they're experiencing, either because they need to expand or because the population has shrunk. In fact, in many cases, because the population of a really beautiful town with many heritage buildings has shrunk. Again, very relevant to this course. Would urge all of you to join. It's completely free to become a member. You then get a newsletter, you know what INTBAU projects are happening around the world to connect you in with pertinent discussions happening in architecture and urbanism from all around the world. So it's completely free to join. And that's at our website, which is intbau.org. And good to finish with a slide that has some element of a master plan, an urban master plan behind it before I hand over to Robert Adam, Professor Robert Adam, who, as I mentioned earlier, was a founder of INTBAU, has been involved with it from the very beginning, and has had a highly successful career both in architecture and urbanism alongside, and is now going to speak to us about the UK experience of rural to urban, urban to rural migration, but also some perspectives that we've gathered from our European chapters around the INTBAU network. And so I will hand over to Robert. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Harriet. Okay, I hope you can all hear me. I will now share my screen. Okay. It's banning me from sharing my screen at the moment.
Perhaps try again in just a sec. I've stopped my share, Bob. It might be
I got it now. And you can all see this? Good. Okay, muy bien. Buenos días a todos. Hablo en inglés. We're talking about depopulation, rural depopulation. This is a useful beginning. This shows just where the concentration of urban development is and how varied the rural condition is in different countries. When you look at the Benelux countries, Holland and Belgium and southern Britain, you can see just to what extent urban development is taking place. When you look at Spain or you look at Scandinavia, you see how much rural countryside there is. I think the issue we have here is quite universal, however. Decline in agriculture, or decline in mechanization of agriculture, the concentration of industry in cities, and particularly the lack of opportunity. I mean, our investigation into all the countries in Europe, this is an underlying problem that leads to migration. And migration leads to lack of services and amenities. And this is the problem I assume we're all talking about. I pose one particular issue. To what extent is this economic? To what extent is this ecological? And to what extent is this aesthetic? A lot of politicians regard it as solely economic. I believe that it's all three of these things together. But if you take an entirely economic view, it has one result. If you take an entirely aesthetic view, it has another result. If you take an entirely ecological view, it has another result. So I'll try and move this on. Just some different places to highlight some of the problems. In Italy, we have Krakow, a well-known, totally abandoned town. I think in Spain, you have the near equivalent or equivalent. In Albania, Kiparo, an abandoned village on the top right. On the other hand, on the bottom left, we have Flam in Norway. And on the bottom right, we have Nuevo Pueblo Mijas, which is entirely a modern creation. These are all very different aspects of what's happening to the countryside. Although the issues are universal, what happens and how this is dealt with and what the situation is not universal. And from our very preliminary investigations, there are different conditions in different parts of Europe, which is to some extent cultural. In Northern Europe, and this does include France, generally there is a desirability to move to the countryside. There's a considerable number of second homes, and there's very often quite significant quality control, control of what actually happens in places. So we look at Flam in Norway. In Norway, many small towns in Norway, you're not allowed to have a second home there. You have to live there permanently, or you can't build anywhere. Eastern Europe situation is not, this is not universal, but the situation is different. We're starting to have rapid suburbanization with villages basically drawn into cities. Very often, but not universally, very poor quality control. In other words, what's happening is effectively destroying the character of the villages. In Southern Europe, again, this is not universal, it's very varied, but there is a significant situation of abandonment or relative abandonment. Also, of course, in Southern Europe, there is tourism, as there is indeed in France. These are significant regenerators. And there's la plus belle village in France, there's les más bonitos pueblos in Spain. There's the idea somehow that tourism is going to rescue this. And to some extent, that is one of the factors. Now, there are various ways of dealing with this. Again, this is just a series of what I would call rough examples. Top left is in Poland, where basically you just, if you want to build in a village or the countryside, you just put a pretty standard product, which could frankly be anywhere. This situation exists in Germany, where for other interesting political reasons, is that in the 1930s, there was a Heimat movement where local distinctiveness and homeliness was associated with the fascist party. So after the war, the idea, even the word, using the word Heimat, was considered in some way to be fascist. So interesting, for this particular reason, quality control has become an issue. The top right, that's in England, that's the idea that when you extend a village, you extend it absolutely in the character of the village. Bottom left, also in England, this is the contrary, where what matters is that although you extend a village or a small town, it is essential that it is different and modern. And in the bottom right, you have Estonia, which is, in many ways, Estonia is the contrast with many other communist countries. The Baltic states have become experiments. Estonia, there's a very heavy preservation movement. So these are all different ways of dealing with this, in this case, villages, but I'll get to small towns in a moment. This is the other one. Here we have an advertisement in English for somewhere in Italy, and one in German for somewhere in France. Is particularly, I think, in the Netherlands and in Germany and in Britain, the relative low prices of second homes in attractive rural locations has resulted in, for example, in the Dordogne in France, if you go to a market, you will hear 50% of the people speaking English. This is a significant phenomenon, particularly significant, of course, in places like southern Spain. But we're not talking about situations like southern Spain. This is a rural condition. So this is a sketch. This is a very approximate view, but whereas the problem is universal, the interpretation, how you deal with it and how it's managed and how it affects one is political and cultural, social, political and cultural. So we can't look at universal situations, but we can learn from one another. Now I will change and I'll talk about the British cultural attitude to the countryside and the impact that this has. And I'll come back to other countries again at the end of this, and I'll come to some examples. In Britain, there's a very particular attitude to the countryside. Top here is a painting by Gainsborough from 1750. And this shows the high status of the countryside. If you made a lot of money in industry, and Britain at this time was making a lot of money in industry, you built a big house in the countryside. You had being in the countryside in a large house had carried maximum status. You may have a place in London, but in the end, your country house was your prime expression of status. And this exists to this day, and it's now been taken on by Russians, Swedes, and other people. Interesting with this one, also, this goes back to 1750. He's got a hunting dog and he's got a gun. Another very important aspect of the preservation of rural Britain is shooting. In fact, so much so that partridge shooting estates are bought by British people in Spain. This is a very, very significant sport. And that's from about 1750. At the bottom here, we have a very well-known British painting by Constable from 1821. We're now in the Romantic period, where the countryside is presented as this idyll, this wonderful rural place. Of course, the reality was completely different. Here is on the top left. Here is an agricultural laborer. These people worked from dawn until dusk, and the attractive cottages they lived in were more usually, as was shown on the right. They were entirely under the control of one landowner, and life was pretty miserable. And this really existed up until very recently. But at the bottom, of course, people moved to towns. So often the living conditions in industrial towns may have been poor, but it was better. There were more opportunities than there were in the countryside. In fact, when people took on servants in the 19th century, the early 20th century, from local girls, the first thing they did was give them a proper meal, because they were 12 or 14. They'd never had a proper meal in their lives. So however, the idea of the countryside, this is a painting by a well-known British artist called Burkitt Foster. This is how they like to imagine the countryside, as a place with happy country people and so on. And this idea that the countryside was an attractive place went right through to the building of model villages. This is Bourneville, the arts and crafts movement. So in Britain, the idea that the countryside is intrinsically desirable, it's a place you want to be, and it's a place that has status, is very deeply embedded in British subconscious. And this in turn had an influence on suburban development. These are advertisements. The top left is showing what is in fact now very much an area of London, a suburb, the ideal life in a cottage-like building. And you look beyond it and you see it's countryside. In fact, it's not. On the top right, you have a popular song. Metroland was another word at the time. But if you look at it, this Metroland, this suburb, is shown as a village. And here we have, on the bottom, a 1930s advertisement where they toured it a garden village. In fact, it's a suburb, and these are suburban houses. So this is very deep-rooted in the British way of thinking. If we then, I think possibly the ultimate expression of this was what is it to be British? These are two posters from the two wars. The left-hand side is the First World War, and the right-hand side is the Second World War. and you'll notice that even in the First World War, that the idea that you were fighting for something was actually the countryside. And in fact, this is ironic because it's a Scottish soldier that is shown because he's wearing a kilt. But what he's pointing at is not something that doesn't exist in Scotland. It's something that exists in England. It's the thatched cottage and the country lane. And on the poster on the right, this is for the Second World War. And so the idea is what you're fighting for is this wonderful countryside, again, with cottages and farms and so on. It's fair to say that really up until this time, life was actually still quite miserable in the countryside for ordinary people. My wife's family's foreman, they had a farm. The only meat they ate before the Second World War was the pig that they kept. They ate no other meat. So this ideal was to some extent a false ideal, but it still exists. There was a song, a sort of propaganda song, if you like, in Britain in the Second World War. It was called "There'll Always Be in England," and two references to it are the country cottage and the country lane. And this has had to this day, this has a significant effect. We have here on the top left, we have a Cotswold village in the sort of South Midlands, effectively, of Britain. This is somewhere which attracts tourism. It's where politicians have houses. It's where it's thought to be the ideal place to live. And the bottom right is actually the village in which I live, where the house prices are so high that you find it very difficult to find anyone to do any menial tasks. But in fact, it's largely a make-believe. Although the village existed, it was in fact largely recreated in about 1900. Top right is a small town. These towns, small towns with all their facilities, have become very desirable places for people to retire to or to downsize to. Not forgetting that if people retire at the age of 60, they probably have 20 more years of healthy life. And so these are identified as very desirable towns. And the bottom left, the same. This is a town in Yorkshire. So these are all regarded as extremely desirable. However, just to highlight the contrast between these, the desirability of these and urban life. In Britain, they have a vote for what are called crap towns. Probably help the translator. Tudades, mierdes. And people vote for where are the worst towns to live in Britain. And these are 4 examples. There are many more. Well, I mean, in a way, one wants to look for what is characteristic of them. And one has to be slightly careful. Most of these are in the English Midlands. They're old industrial towns. And most of them have gone through regeneration, which just not really worked. They have modern regeneration. They suffer from significant decline. They have immigration problems and so on. Well, to be slightly careful about making too many generalizations about these. But there is undoubtedly, there is a significant economic, there's a significant historic issue to these. And there's also an aesthetic issue. At the same time, a large number of newspapers, their sections they run, where is the best place to live? Now, interestingly, these are examples of places that have been chosen as the best places to live. And I think, again, it's probably a little bit easier to look at these and reach some sort of conclusion. These are small towns, small rural towns. And I say at this point, I must sort of interrupt my dialogue to say that when we were first asked to do this, we were asked to look at a rural condition. Now, in England, in English, and indeed in some other North European countries, the word rural only means the countryside and villages. But I think the issue with rural, as I understand it, seen in Spanish, Portuguese, and possibly Italian, is considered to also include small towns, small rural towns. So these are these would not normally be called rural, what we're showing here. But I think in the context of this discussion, we should include these as rural. But these small towns have that are considered as desirable places to live. They're almost always historic. In fact, they are always historic. They're relatively small with immediate access to the countryside. They have strong sense of community, and they generally have good facilities. In other words, there are local shops, there are local butchers, and there is a strong, usually a strong town council. This comes up again and again. These are considered to be desirable places to live. And I think at this point I introduce another significant issue, which was happening in Britain and is happening certainly in other North European countries, is that the move out from towns into the countryside was becoming significant. It was people wanted to move out to these places which were identified as the great places to live. And this is a significant aspect of rural regeneration. Immediately after the Second World War, for example, cottages, historic cottages were being demolished. Within 10 or 15 years, not only were they being protected, but their value had gone up enormously. And the drop in agricultural labor, which was enormous, was compensated for by the fact that people wanted to live in these villages. There was still rural poverty, but however, in effect, the desirability of the places saved them. And I think we need to look now at the situation that is happening now. What the key issue with these is communication. Is actually you can live in these places and you can communicate effectively wherever you like. What is also happening in Britain, and research my former firm did actually demonstrates this, is that in London, which of course is the major economic center, people are moving further and further away. For a start, the prices are lower. The countryside is thought to be more desirable, but they don't have to work in the city all the time. They only have to work 2 or 3 days a week in the city. And what we have now is probably throughout the world, and I think in European countries particularly, we have probably the greatest experiment that has ever taken place in home working. It's the idea that is provided you have good internet connection, you can work quite satisfactorily at home. So if that is the case, of course, you can move to somewhere that is considered to be more desirable. And in Britain, that is considered to be the countryside. So provided you have reasonable communication, in other words, you can get in and out of these places relatively simply, a relative amount of wealth, and not forgetting that in Britain, the service industries, things like banking and so on, are the major industries. You're not tied to a particular place. You're only tied to a place by agglomeration economics. In other words, the benefit of being in the city, but you don't have to be there 5 days a week to do this. So this is the point at which, if you like, economics, aesthetics and ecology come together, because you also want a pleasant countryside in which to walk in and for recreation. So at this point, economics, aesthetics, and ecology come together. This is a different version of Richard Florida's well-known book, Cities and the Creative Class, where the idea of the attractive cities, nice cities, you could draw in the creative class because they could be, they weren't tied to a raw material or a factory. This is now, if you like, the rural environment and the creative class. because in fact, all the service industries, it is now possible to live in these places. Whereas, and the key factor in this is internet speed. Of course, in Britain, we also we do try and regenerate cities, and in Britain, the National Lottery has had a history of giving funds to projects which regenerate towns. This is not entirely rural, I have to say, but I just put this up as an example. There is a history of success and failure with these. There is a belief that, usually a middle class belief, that everyone really wants arts facilities, and therefore you go into an old industrial town and give people arts facilities, and suddenly the place will regenerate. Well, I think some of them discovered that practically nobody in those towns went to them because they weren't really very interested in the arts that middle class people were interested in. Top left is called the Public. That failed very quickly. The National Centre for Popular Music, Sheffield, which is actually a major city, that also failed. The National Space Centre, Leicester, it's successful in itself, but if you look at its surroundings, you will see that it is not really embedded in the town at all. It will make very little difference to the general regeneration. These are also receive significant public funds. The Turner Contemporary, the bottom right in Margate. Now, Margate was a declining seaside town. The interesting thing about this is that this is in the centre. You can see it in the distance there. It's a very modern piece of architecture, very well regarded, but it really it was the icing, it's Slaginde, on what was already regenerating. What was happening was that these we call third-tier towns, which are either rural or seaside, were actually already experiencing an increase in popularity. So that point, that kind of paints what I call a very broad picture of the British cultural attitude. And also, I think, how that fits in with the broader European condition. It is a very specific cultural phenomenon. And there are areas in the British countryside and these small towns which are in severe decline. I don't want to paint a picture which is, Britain is not the place where everything in the countryside is wonderful. It's not. There is significant rural poverty. There's still significant rural poverty. There are still seriously declining towns. But as I've already explained, for rather particular reasons, there are ways where this decline has not happened, and some of this is cultural, and some of this is economic, but it is also aesthetic. Sweden. This is a Swedish example here. This is they have similar votes and similar. They're slightly different. This is Borlänge. In sort of central Sweden, which was voted as the ugliest place in Sweden. Again, it shares some of the characteristics Cidades Mierdes, the crap towns in Britain had. Very close to Borlänge is Falun. Which was, it was one of the places, and they don't quite have the same real estate analysis, but this was regarded as one of the best places to live in Sweden. And you'll see that there is there is some commonality with the British best places to live and worst places to live. This is France. Again, I want to be slightly careful with these analyses because there are other conditions. For example, they're quite regional. Northern France old industrial area has a lot of problems with urban decline. Both of these places are actually in northern France, which I show here. Southern France, of course, has its coast. The interesting thing about rural France, about Lot and the Dordogne, is I think something wants to look to is the idea that there are places that are not on the coast, which are significantly attractive. On the left, this was in one of the French newspapers did a rating of votes on the best place to live and the best place to work. And Maubeuge was voted as one of the worst places, and Montélimar was voted as one of the best places. Again, one doesn't want to oversimplify this, but and I've chosen my pictures very carefully, but there are significant characteristics relate to where thought to be good places to live and where thought to be bad places to live. And when one talks about regeneration, and one talks about economic regeneration, and in a lot of cases there are, in past in Britain, they built major shopping complexes as a way of regenerating. But of course, this turned out to be completely false, because now the retail market has completely collapsed. And what's happening with these regenerating shopping malls is that they're closing. This happened in America before it happened in Britain. The idea that there are these major single simple things that are going to regenerate someone, I think is probably not correct. It's a more complex issue. I'll now complete my talk, and in this case I'm going to show examples of my own work and the work of my former firm. These are quite varied, and I'll go straight into them, and you can like them or dislike them, but I'm trying to demonstrate that each one has its own lessons. The first one was a very small. Well, as to whether it's a town or a village is rather difficult, because what's happened, and this is another indication in Britain, is that places that are towns, people have decided to call them villages, because the word village has so much positive connotation to it, that a town will be called a village. This is really a small town, but it's the size of a village. And what happened in this town was that in the 1960s, this is not thought to be a desirable place to live. It's in the English Midlands. It's relatively close to some big factories. And if you look on the left, as existing at the time, there were apartment blocks, small apartment blocks were put up in the center. And these had declined. But they were right at the principal intersection. House prices, I have to say this is another issue, is that a measure of desirability is the price of residential property. This has its negative sides, because in the village where I live, for example, the prices are so high that actually anyone who has a housing problem and a low income can't live there. I mean, there are specific measures introduced to overcome this. So the existing here was very poor. So what happened, we looked at it and we effectively restored the texture of the small houses which existed in the rest of this village. And on the bottom left is what was there, what was the original. Now, the lesson we learned from this was interesting, is that when they started, they sold the land for £1, which would be the equivalent of about 1.5 euros. All this land, because it was worth so little that basically you couldn't give it away. When the first houses were built, the developer went into a panic, went into a crisis, because they were not selling, because the place was considered to be so undesirable. By the time they built the other side of the road and started to create a place, the prices went up by about 400%. because people could see that the place was starting to improve, and it became a desirable place. That was the lesson we learned from this. I mean, this remains a relatively low value village, but by giving it a better center, and the houses are very simple. There's nothing complicated about them. And we actually built a new little cross in the center. As soon as you actually created a place which was more desirable, the people wanted to live there. This is another extension to a village. This is in the east, southeast, or the east of England. This was we effectively more than doubled the size of this village. If you look at the top picture, the left-hand side is the village, and the right-hand side is the extension to the village. Again, this was not particularly high value, but the key to this was to create something that actually had the character, it's a very specific character of this village. This village was a very particular village. It was originally owned by a large estate, and the character of this particular part of England is expressed in these houses. This is done some years ago, but is now still held up in this area as an example of how to regenerate a village. The only criticism of it I would have is that we were not allowed to produce the density which we believed we should have produced, but that's another story. This is a small rural town in the west of England, which had suffered quite serious decline by rather bad planning in the 1960s and 70s. And we were brought in, this part of this land was owned by the Prince of Wales's estate, and we were brought in to effectively design a significant extension to this town. And this has been going on for some years. Again, the principle with this was to make sure that we extended and elaborated on the character of the town. A little mixed picture about to what extent this improved the house prices in the area. It actually created a place which was considered to be desirable. But I think the important thing with this, I would like to say, you know, that this increased the house prices hugely, and it did to some extent. But the important thing with this was it increased the critical mass of the town. In other words, by increasing that, all these properties sold very well, but they also increased the population. And in a small town, by increasing the population, you increase the viability of the individual properties and the viability of the town itself. So in other words, the retail, which was going into decline and was going into very serious decline, was to some extent rescued by this development. And I say finally, this is a different case again. This is a town called Newquay in the southwest of England, and at the bottom left you can see this was in serious decline. The number of effectively small hotels, they were going bankrupt at a rate of about one per month. It has regenerated for a number of different reasons, and it would be wrong to say that what was being shown here, which is a major extension, the square on the bottom right shows the area which is extended. Again, this is land owned by the Prince of Wales's estate. And this is effectively a new district of this town. In fact, it was started to regenerate for other reasons, but again, by increasing the desirability of the place, the desirability of the place to live, you actually you increase the economic profile. And this is the extension to the town, which has which actually, if anything, enhances the specific character of this area. In this case, the increase in property value is considerable. relative to the rest of the town. Now that can be a good thing and a bad thing, but what it does is it shows that if you actually pay attention, if you like, to the aesthetic, it has an enhancing effect. Well, that's the end of my talk, but to allow enough time for any discussion and questions. I think one must be careful about taking a particular country as the example, and tries to draw what one can from this. And it's fair to say that Britain is dominated by service industries, therefore location where you live is not so closely related to the way you work. So what we have on the one hand is throughout Europe we have, and all of our contacts have told us that the issue of depopulation, particularly the collapse of services, education, and retail, this appears to be quite universal. But in each different country, Germany, for example, is not a huge problem with poverty in the countryside, but their problem is and also Germany has a history of originally being, not that long ago, being small states. And so you often get industries, quite major industries, located in relatively rural places. But at the same time, it has a political history of which is now starting to end, of if you actually get involved in a certain kind of aesthetics, that gives you a political problem. Whereas in the Scandinavian countries, again, they have the same problem of depopulation, but a very large number of people in the Scandinavian countries have second homes in the countryside, to the extent that it is a problem in Norway. And I say central France, its depopulation has to some extent been reversed by repopulation by British and German people and people from the Netherlands. At the same time, there's a move out to the countryside within France itself. So tourism has different aspects. There's internal tourism and external tourism. So I hope that this talk gives if you like, a broad picture, but I believe that aesthetics, economics, and ecology actually can come together and can actually assist. But I'll be very interested to hear what other people's views are on this. So I will now unshare my screen and see if there are any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert and Harriet, for being here, for your participation. We have a very close cooperation with INTBAU. For us, it was very, very important to have the INTBAU participation at this forum. I thank you very much because, Robert, you put on the table some very important questions. First of all, your whole statement was about cultural heritage. And I would like to stress that cultural heritage is one of the main lines of this forum. How can cultural heritage to help for improving the life and in the rural areas? You stress also that these villages, you spoke about these places, there is livable places for living, but there are also an opportunity for retired people now to be retired at 60, 65 years. Doesn't mean to be retired of the life, because you can continue. You have in front of you 10, 20 years more, and how to live this year, how to organize life program. And these places are, of course, a very good opportunity. And then it was important to say it in the forum. I would like to stress, as the previous speaker said, INTBAU, that we have to study, we have to think more about the connectivity of these areas. I said during my opening speech, taking the words of the lady responsible for this question of Spanish government level, that the connectivity should be technological, but also human and social. And then I think it's a question we have to study more, to explore more about. You spoke about the coincidence between economy and ecology, what is also very positive for the future. And finally, you spoke, for me, it's a very important question about the balance that are bringing this supermarket towards the traditional shops, towards the traditional trade. And I think it's also a point to take into consideration, because traditional shops for Spain are a very important element of heritage, and also a very important element for the quality of life. It is not the same thing to go to a big supermarket. You can buy everything, of course, but the question is that the human contact and the social cohesion is made in the baker shop, in the small traditional shops. And I think we have to take into account as a phenomenon. Then thank you very much. I don't know if there are questions now.
I don't know if Robert wants to answer you. I would like to.
I wanted to, points. The issue of cultural heritage, which of course is an enormous benefit in Britain and in other North European countries. The thing in Spain is that a lot of your close to abandoned towns have fantastic cultural heritage. So the cultural heritage is not enough. These are wonderful places which are being abandoned. To extraordinary extent in some cases. And yes, retirement I think is important, but I just like to tie what you said about retirement and the supermarket and the local shop. Is of course the local shops are not operated by retired people. So it's trying to get that balance. If a place is desirable for retirement, the danger is it becomes only occupied by retired people and becomes an old people's home, except on an urban scale. So there's an interesting balance there. I agree completely on the issue of connectivity in every sense. But I think for getting younger people into these places, which one wants to do, one wants to get a mixed community as much as possible. Technical connectivity is very important, as indeed actually is the ability to leave there as well as in it to leave for a while and to come back. The supermarket one is very interesting because I think it remains more significant in Spain and Italy and Portugal than it does in some other North European countries, where the supermarkets have taken over. The interesting issue that actually has happened, this is another aspect of our COVID-19 or our virus, is that people are turning to their local shops much more. Now, it'd be interesting to see if this continues. What we're seeing is that the local shops, in order to survive financially, have actually presented a very attractive service, and also have much more variety of goods. In Germany, one of the problems with the small towns, and I don't know how this translates, but in America it's called donutting. It's where the center declines and everyone moves to the periphery. In Germany, they have this problem. This is a common problem. In Germany, they subsidize. They provide additional financial benefit for business, for the important businesses, the key life businesses. You know, the groceries, the butcher, and so on. They provide subsidies for local people, for local shopkeepers to occupy them. I think we all recognize this is important. But unfortunately, supermarkets do provide a very easy answer, but they provide a socially bad answer. So I think this is an interesting problem, and it may be that the only way to deal with it is by subsidy.
Well, I wanted to make 2 comments. First one is, I mean, it's shocking for us living in Spain, seeing how it is valued in the north of Europe and in the United Kingdom to live in the countryside. And obviously that there are reasons for this. One is the lack of basic facilities and infrastructures in Spain and Southern Europe in general. And the other one is the stigmatization of living in the countryside. I mean, you are considered a second-class citizen if you don't live in a city. And this is something that maybe Artemio can talk about later this afternoon. And the other issue is, I mean, referring to your comments about traditional architecture, and I mean, I was refreshing Aldo Rossi as you spoke. I mean, I think traditional architecture has been tested over the years, proven harmonic and nice, but I mean, you cannot put aside very relevant modern architecture. So, I mean, the same way there is very nice traditional architecture, there is fantastic modern architecture, which people value. People value living in the Siedlungen in Berlin or in Dessau, and I think that there is a debate on how the values can change with while keeping cultural heritage, historic sites alive. I mean, my question to you is, what do you do with windmills in historic countrysides? What do you do with solar panels? Should you forbid them? Should you allow them? How do you adapt to modern life?
Yes, in the end, I say windmills just tend to occupy the countryside. People have very different views about them, but do they spoil the countryside? I don't know if they do or not. The issue about modern architecture is two aspects of this. One is being modern in order to be modern. In other words, in order to express it very explicitly. Another is to be modern just to you know, to have good plumbing. And solar panels are an issue, but I think most places which have a strong identity, this is really about identity, and we say have a strong identity, they can accept a significant amount of modern, let's call it different, because rather than saying anything else, is different. They can accept a certain amount of different architecture because their identity is strong enough. There's a moment in this when the difference, what is deliberately different, destroys the character of the place that it's in. That's the balance. Now, what again, this is you know, there's the way architects think, and there's the way that the rest of the world, the rest of the purchasing world thinks. And it may be different in Spain to what it is in Britain and other countries. For example, in the Netherlands, for very particular political reasons and land sale reasons, there is a lot of, let's call it, different architecture produced. But when I go to the Netherlands, I ask people, I said, if you wanted to buy a house, what kind of house would you really want to buy? And they say, a small house with a pitched roof and a little garden. So, I think when this is reflected in what the public think. What we're not talking about architects here, we're talking about what the public values, and what the public values is very important for regeneration. So fine. For example, one of the examples I showed you, which was a very modern development in a village, I don't know if you recall at the bottom left, actually that went bankrupt because it wasn't, the cost was too high and it wasn't selling. But having said that, it wasn't harmful to the village because the village already had a strong character. So somewhere in there is this balance. If people want to move somewhere because it has a particular character, it is very important that you don't destroy that character, because you destroy the reason that they want to go there. So that's the balance. There is no inevitability about the aesthetics of let's call it modern architecture or different architecture. You can, with modern building construction, you can build anything you want. But what's very important about the regeneration of these things is not satisfying anything particularly architectural. It's making sure that people, in the broadest sense of the word, want to be there. Now, if they want to be there because it has different architecture, then it should have different architecture. That's fine, there's no problem at all. But actually, that's what we're talking about. It's about getting people to places because they want to be there. And if the heritage is why they want to be there, that's what you have to address.
I think you said it rightly. It's not about the architecture, it's about the character. So, architecture could change while keeping the character, while keeping the right values that make the place special.
I agree, but very often the character has various aspects, of course. It's the urban form and there's other things, but it's also what it looks like. I'm afraid, most people, when they talk about a character place, they actually say, well, that's what it looks like, therefore it has that character. So it's also about urban form, in fairness. It's not just the little bits in there. It's also about the urban form, and a very strong urban form can absorb a great deal of difference. But in the end, I'm afraid that architecture is an aesthetic phenomenon as well as a social and construction phenomenon, and it is about what it looks like. And if a place stops looking like a desirable place because of the architecture, then there it is. It could have a negative effect.
Right. I don't know if anyone else has any other comments or questions.
I think there was one on the chat from Ahmed Ayman Isa.
Yes, let me see. What happens in countryside after World War II, especially the world go to the urban areas, and now we want to return to develop the countryside. The point is, are you responsible about that? And what is the procedure that makes the character of our countryside from another one? And he continues, is the local community involved to develop the countryside? And is there a political and economical affection on this development of the countryside?
Okay, that's a very good series of questions. In fact, there's a whole series of questions there. Speaking in the British example, was quite a complicated situation. It was largely in the 1950s that the major mechanized farming started to take place. The drop in the number of people required for agriculture was dramatic. I mean, my wife's family had a farm which I think employed 10, 15 people. It now employs one. I mean, this is huge. This is dramatic. And also we knew people who had never been to the next village. I mean, that's what it was like. It's not like that anymore. So what happened after the Second World War was that there was a huge decline in population for a moment. And again, I'm old enough to remember this. They were demolishing medieval timber frame cottages just to sell the timber. Within 10 to 15 years, the value of those had gone up so much that the value, there's no point in demolishing them because they had more value as they were. What happened was the cultural attractiveness of the countryside effectively saved it. Of course, the local people who lived in the village were very upset because these were all new people and how dare they move there. But they didn't recognize that these new people were actually saving the places. You say, what is the procedure? What makes the character of our countryside known and distinguish one countryside from another? That is an interesting, complex question. Whether it's in, I won't speak for other countries, but I think the situation in Britain is broadly the same. Of course, but if the countryside, or particularly the settlements in the countryside, first of all, the countryside was made by geography and agriculture, effectively. So, but the settlements in the countryside, of course, if they're old, they were created. What made them different was precisely their locality. They tended to use local materials because everything was moved by horse and cart, and you don't move anything by horse and cart very far unless you absolutely have to. So they developed a character which was very specific to the, if you like, the geology very often of the place, because we don't have to do that now, and we don't. There's no economic. However, if we want to maintain the character of the places, then we have to have regard to that. Politically, certainly in Britain, there is a very strong political movement that local people should be closely involved in the development, in the control of the development of places. I mean, this is not just in Britain. This is in many other countries. The first thing that happens is that people don't want new development. Well, that's always a problem. But what we discover is that people are very concerned about losing the character of the places they live in. I mean, they have bought the character of a place, or they were brought up in the character of the place, and they really, really don't want to lose that. Very often they think that new development itself will lose that, but actually, to some extent, it will. I mean, a village can double in size, it can disappear and become a suburb, but sometimes it will. But very often they've moved to that place, or they live in that place, or they continue to live in that place because they find it attractive, and they want it to continue to be attractive. So in a way, the political involvement at a local level is a mirror of the general attitude to the character of a place and how important it is. I mean, I can talk. I'll stop on that because the politics of it is long and complicated. But I hope that answers the question.
I don't know if there are other questions from the participants. I think it is not the case. Then
there's a comment by Lucia that I will translate. She says, I think in this forum, the landscape and its resources, nature determine habitants and its constructions. Modernity in architecture must be debated from equilibrium and dialogue, from landscape and from who want to live in it, and it must be at the service of society and nature. What is known as modern architecture to be introduced in landscapes with personality does not work in the same way. It is man that is controlling nature and not the other way around.
Right, I was going to respond to that. What I didn't talk about was I tended to concentrate on settlements. All of these settlements sit in the landscape. That's why they're rural. And the rural environment, I think, throughout Europe is to a significant extent man-made, but it all depends on the geography. And there's a whole other debate about agriculture and how agriculture treats the landscape. We in Britain, and I think in other countries, we had the English expression, and it's a horrible word, was prairification. In other words, they removed hedges. People actually industrialized agriculture as much as they could. The strongest example of this was it was in the Netherlands. Actually, very interesting to hear it. Actually, is that I think 1947 was called the starvation year. Is that the Netherlands turned over to maximum agriculture and industrialization of agriculture, and they now regret how much that has destroyed the character of the countryside. Is the people who live in these villages and towns, one of the reasons that the countryside is attractive is they can get into it and enjoy it. This in the past has caused a conflict between farmers who want to make the most money out of it and the people who live there who want to enjoy agriculture, enjoy the countryside. I think that is changing now. There's a significant move to improve the ecology in countryside. There are regulations in this respect. So there's an interesting balance. But as for, I think one must be careful about this use of the word modernity. Modern can just mean what's happening now and is efficient. And you can produce buildings that look different, that's to a degree, but if you actually respond directly to the character of the countryside and the character of the place, this works quite well. So I would like to say that every building needs to look like an old building, but that's not strictly true. At the same time, I think you need to have regard. I go back to the point, to the character of the place and the character, and that includes the character of the countryside.
Robert, we are going now to move to the last speaker of this morning, who is Federico Martelli.